say it's limited probability at this point. There is some data from the World Cancer Research Foundation, or Fund, and the American Institute for Cancer Research. They did a pretty big comprehensive review of all the food, nutrition, physical activity information and how it relates to cancer prevention. They did this globally. So they have really put it in that category of limited. It's there's a relationship, but you can't say, if you do this, it will cause that.
Right. We can't draw that straight line from the exposure to the
Yeah, we
disease.
know that.
Sure.
When are we going to actually be able to draw that line? I don't know if ever.
Maybe never.
I don't, with cancer, I agree with you. I really don't know if ever that you can say one thing happens, we do this and this happens. I mean, we certainly know with tobacco exposure, for instance, that there's a very strong relationship. But nobody's going to conduct a randomized controlled trial that randomizes people to smoking and non-smoking to prove that point.
Sure. And they're not going to do this with barbecued meat or with exposure to any other potentially cancer-causing chemicals.
It's very difficult. It would be a very expensive trial to do, and it's a very difficult trial to control.
Exactly.
I mean,
well,
we don't live in boxes, and I think
that's right.
We don't live in this little bubble world where we can control absolutely everything. So it's very difficult. And I also really play back to that our genes are just one part of it, and just because we have a gene for, say, breast cancer, doesn't mean we'll ever develop breast cancer. So that's why genetics is so controversial, too, because just because you have the gene doesn't mean that you will definitely develop that cancer that you're at risk for.
Genetics loads the gun, and the environment pulls the trigger.
Right. I love that quote.
We've
There's
used that
something
quote
that has to initiate it. Something has to turn it on.
Well, let's just talk about the different types of cancer that have been associated with exposures. I mean, I have 4 studies sitting here in front of me. One is an American Cancer Society study. Actually, it was done by the University of Minnesota.
That was the pancreatic cancer.
The pancreatic cancer one. We have another one that was done at the University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Center, presented at the American Association for Cancer Research's 101st annual meeting in this year, April 20th. And that says that meat, especially when it's well done, may increase the risk of bladder cancer. And then we have another one from, this is back a little bit further, back from 2006, talking about another study that was done at Johns Hopkins Kimmel Cancer Center, and it was presented at the American Association for Cancer Research in D.C., showing a relationship to charred meat chemical and prostate cancer incidence or higher incidence. So we're talking about some serious things. Pancreatic cancer, which is one of the most problematic and lethal cancers, and then bladder cancer and prostate cancer. What other types of cancer have been associated that you know from
Stomach
studies?
cancer is one. And I believe colon cancer as well. Okay. And there may be even some relationships that we don't quite understand, because our exposure can really be, we often think about exposure kind of translating itself through the bloodstream or something like that. So those types of exposures where it's just not necessarily in one area, and so it can just land in our tissues.
Right. I know that the Long Island breast cancer study, which was actually looking for environmental contaminants and higher incidences of breast cancer on Long Island, several years ago, actually did show one positive relationship, and that was between higher incidence of breast cancer and exposure to PAHs. And they were clear, in that, PAHs could come from vehicular emissions, but PAHs also come from backyard barbecues and from smoking cigarettes and anything else that's burning wood stoves or even your fireplace.
That's right. There's so many exposures. It's really hard to say, okay, what do I do with this information?
Yeah.
How do I apply this in my regular life and also live? I think it's very important that, one of the messages I like to get out to cancer survivors is there isn't one thing that you did wrong to cause your cancer. There's just a lot of things that we can do, though, to maybe prevent the next cancer or a recurrence. and realize that the world of cancer is pretty darn gray. I mean, it's not black and white.
After all these years.
Yeah.
After all these years, it's a very frustrating disease. Unlike, cardiovascular disease where things are a little bit more clear cut.
Sure.
Cancer's tricky.
Yeah, cancer seems to be very tricky. And, I'd like to start talking about some interesting information that I read about preparing meats and actually being able to reduce the amount of HCAs that are produced if you prepare meats in certain ways.
Yes.
And also talk about roasting and slow cooking meats. I mean, one of our favorite things is pot roast and stew if we ever have meat. So I guess we're okay by slow cooking those things.
And fruits and vegetables.
Well, of course. I mean, I think that you're advocating reduction of meat in our diet in general, and I agree 100%. Yeah. We've read a few things. The National Cancer Institute has actually talked about the use of a microwave oven to partially cook meat before you put it on a grill. And that actually that lessens the levels of CHAs or HCAs. I'm sorry, and also we have seen some studies about using spices that can inhibit the creation of harmful chemical compounds. So I'm not sure, Denise, whether this is an area that you have any knowledge, but maybe we can go ahead and throw it out there.
Well, the one thing about spices, I think there are some different spices out there that are being studied. I think it's cumin and curcumin, and I'm not very good with the pronunciations of some of these things, but also in terms of marinating and things like that as another thing that sort of protects the meats, and in particular, folks can use the citrus-based marinades seem to do very well at protecting our meat from the HCA formation.
And what about this microwaving for 2 minutes? And that seemed to be a dramatic. I mean, they were talking about a 90% reduction in HCAs.
Right, and I think what one thing that microwaving does is it limits the cooking time. Mm-hmm. So how much time you'd actually have to put something on the grill. And that's another reason that I'll often recommend if somebody's going to put some meat on the grill to think about doing more kebabs. Mm-hmm. and things of that nature, because then they're smaller pieces of food. They don't take as long to cook. We certainly want people to get the right internal temperature on their foods because we don't want them to have exposures in another area of having undercooked food. But they can use a thermometer and things like that, too.
Did we actually come up with a temperature that, a temperature that at which point we should be concerned? How high does it have to get? 400 degrees, 450?
I would say, anything over the 350 mark is probably putting you into a category of exposing to a high temperature. And most folks, when they're doing the charbroiling and the grilling and the broiling, are broiling at high temperatures, 400, 450, 500 degrees. So if we can cook things on lower temperatures and cook for longer periods, like roasting, which uses a much more moist method of keeping our food moist and not drying out.
Okay, so I from my perspective, some lightly grilled zucchini, organic zucchini, and just a bunch of really nice salads, quinoa with avocado and scallions and tomatoes, and maybe a nice potato salad, and nice coleslaw, and this would be a great cookout for me.
Well, we've talked about, we often talk about using meat as a condiment rather than a
main course.
Than the main course.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And as far as meat servings anyway, we should really be reducing our consumption of meat to about 18 ounces a week or less.
And what does that translate into practically? What's
how many hamburgers is that?
3-ounce portion is probably the size of the palm of your hand, Patty.
Okay, so that's
it's not
3
very
ounce.
big. Mm-hmm, that's about 3 ounces, and that would be 6 times a week. So, and a lot of times what happens is exactly what Doug mentioned, which is, we're trying to use it as a condiment or just have some of it. I mean, first of all, it's good for our health. Second of all, I really think it's good in terms of environmental impact if we eat less meat.
No question. Let's get into that a little bit.
Well, before we do that, I just want to ask about, a lot of the things that we talk about, Denise, on this program we talk about cumulative effects over time. Mm-hmm. Is that the case that we're talking about here, where we're talking about, a prolonged, ingestion of these things over a period of years that results is that part of what's leading to the cancer?
It definitely could be cumulative effects. I think about cancer a lot that way, and I think if you were somebody who was grilling every single day, you're going to be put into a different category of risk than somebody who doesn't do it at all. And but that's not really practical either, to think all or nothing. So I think this is just one thing. There are many, and what you're grilling really matters. If you can mix it up a little bit, put some things on the grill, reduce the temperature, microwave. If you can do a bunch of little things, I think that can also have a positive impact. And not to grill and not to really consume at all, if at all possible, any processed meat, hot dogs in particular, sausages. They're just really harmful.
That is a question that I had for you. The meat, we're going to get back to meat itself and the environmental impact and so on, but let's just talk about fresh meats as opposed to processed meats. And, the other things that you might find in processed meats that you don't find in the fresh meats, and then those things on top of the HCAs or the PAHs. Would you eat a hot dog?
Would I eat a hot dog?
Yeah, there you go, Denise. It's the question.
I'll tell you, I really don't like hot dogs, and I actually get very upset with my family when they choose to have hot dogs. And I know it's tough to be married to a dietitian and have a dietitian for a mother, but those are the two things where I just wince. I would really prefer that they never exist in my household, but can I say that never happens? No. But if it's my choice, I'm not eating a hot dog. I'll go for a veggie dog, maybe.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what's in processed meats.
Oh, yes, the processed meats. They have lots of nitrates, and those nitrate compounds to cure the meat, and often salt cured, and all of these things combined make it not so good for our health. And that is actually one of the recommendations from the American Institute for Cancer Research. Is they say no processed meats, avoid them. It is one of the foods that we come out saying people should really not have this.
You're listening to Green Street, Patti and Doug Wood, and our special guest today, Denise Snyder, Associate Dean for Clinical Research at the Duke School of Medicine, in an interview we recorded a few years ago, but which still holds true today. Green Street is a production of our nonprofit organization, Grassroots Environmental Education, and you can learn more about the show and listen to past shows at our program website, which is greenstreetnews.org. That's going to do it for this edition of Green Street. Patti and I will be back next week with another edition of the show. Thanks for listening.